The machine breathed for her. That slow, mechanical rise and fall. I watched it the way you watch something you're afraid to look away from. 3 days she had been in that bed. 3 days of fluorescent hallways and nurses who spoke in careful, measured voices. The kind people use when the real words are too heavy to hand to someone standing up. Broken spine. Spinal cord involvement. If she stabilizes. I heard all of it the way you hear sound underwater. Present but distorted. Close but not quite landing. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was at my kitchen table, coffee in my hand. Nothing unusual about the hour, nothing warning me. My phone rang and a voice said there had been an accident on Route 9 and I needed to come now. I was in my car before I fully understood what my body was doing. 11 minutes to the hospital. I know because I counted every red light I ran. She was behind glass when I arrived. Tubes, machines, a stillness about her that didn't look like sleep. I pressed my hand flat against that window and I made a decision. Not out loud, not even fully formed, just a quiet closing of something inside me. Tears were for later. There was work to be done first. My name is Aletha McCall. I raised my daughter alone from the time she was 7 years old, on a teacher's salary and a particular kind of stubbornness that doesn't announce itself. I am not a woman of wealth or connections that show up on paper. What I have is patience and memory, and the good sense to stay quiet until quiet is no longer the right tool. I learned early to stand in the background of my daughter's life, not because I didn't belong there, but because she had built something so full and so beautiful that the best thing I could do was let her live in it without her mother making it smaller. If you're watching this late at night or first thing in the morning, go ahead and drop the time in the comments. I want to know when this story is finding you. By day 3, I knew which nurses worked which shifts. I kept my phone charged and my bag packed, and my expression neutral. I was not falling apart. I was paying attention. On the evening of day 3, I called Aldrich, her husband, a man who had not called once since the accident, a man who had not appeared at this hospital, had not sent word, had not done any single thing a husband does when his wife is fighting for her life. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. His mother, Eula. I told her calmly that Yvette was in the ICU with a broken spine and that the doctors needed family present for decisions that were coming. There was a pause, and then she said, and I want you to hear this exactly as I heard it. Stop calling my son. We never wanted a low-level black girl in his life anyway. I ended the call. No argument, no raised voice, one button and silence. I sat with it, let it move through me the way cold moves through bone, slow and deep and permanent. Then I looked through that ICU glass at my daughter, and I made a decision so quiet it barely made a sound inside me. That night, I stopped in the hospital parking lot and sat in my car for 20 minutes. Then I opened my glove compartment. There was a sealed envelope, something I had found before the wedding, something I chose not to use because Yvette was happy, and I believed in her happiness more than I believed in my suspicion. I looked at that envelope for a long time. Tonight, that changes. I walked to the nurse's station on day 4 and asked a simple question. The nurse checked her screen without looking up. Primary next of kin. Aldrich Carter. Medical Decision Authority. Aldrich Carter. She read it the way people read routine information, flat, procedural, unbothered. I thanked her. Then I walked back down that fluorescent hallway and stopped grieving and started thinking. Let me tell you who my daughter is. Yvette spent her 20s inside an architecture firm that paid her half of what they paid the men sitting beside her and expected twice the output. She did not complain. She outperformed. By her mid-30s, she had a portfolio that made people stop talking when she walked into a room, not because of how she looked, but because of what she had built. She was precise, disciplined, entirely self-made in the way only certain women understand. The ones who learn early that nobody is coming to hand them anything they do not fight to keep. Claudine noticed. Claudine had spent 40 years building influence in this city the way serious women do, quietly, completely, without needing applause attached to it. When she saw what Yvette was becoming, she did not offer encouragement. She offered action. A property she owned outright was transferred directly into Yvette's name. Legal, documented, absolute. Claudine told her, "Property belongs to the people who will protect it." The first time I walked through that house, I had to keep my hands at my sides, not because it was extravagant, though it was, but because I understood what it had actually cost her. Years. Every early morning, every weekend sacrificed, every room where she had to outperform someone simply to be considered equal. I was proud, in the kind of way that almost hurts to carry. She met Aldrich 2 years later at an industry event. He came from a family with money, comfortable, connected, the kind of family people mistake for old wealth because they have spent years learning how to perform stability publicly. He was charming in a way I recognized immediately. Not loud charm, focused charm. The kind that identifies the most valuable person in a room and settles beside them naturally enough that nobody notices the calculation underneath it. When he met me, he was warm. When he met Claudine, he became warmer. I noticed both things. I said nothing about either. There was one moment during the wedding reception that stayed with me long after the music stopped. Aldrich was laughing at something his brother said when his eyes moved briefly across the room. Quick, measuring, not admiring the life around him. Assessing it. The look disappeared almost immediately. Yvette stood beside him, glowing with happiness. And I told myself what mothers often tell themselves when they are afraid of becoming suspicious too early. That I was imagining things because I feared losing my place in my daughter's life. So I chose trust instead. And then I lived inside that choice. After the wedding, Yvette reorganized portions of her financial life, the way many married people do when they fully believe in the future they are building with someone. Joint household accounts for shared expenses, emergency access permissions, a durable power of attorney covering medical situations if one of them became incapacitated unexpectedly. The mansion itself remained solely in her name. So did the primary ownership structures connected to her business interests and long-term holdings. Claudine had advised her very clearly before the marriage not to merge everything completely, and on that point, Yvette actually listened. What she did allow were connected permissions around management continuity and emergency access, survivorship instructions on selected accounts, temporary operational authority if she became medically unable to handle active projects herself, standard estate coordination documents people often sign once marriage makes separate lives start functioning practically as one. Everything was signed properly, notarized, legal. And from Yvette's perspective, reasonable, because from her perspective there was nothing to protect herself from. She told me once, "A marriage where you're protecting your exit isn't really a marriage." I agreed with her then. Part of me still does. What she did not understand was that Aldrich had already started thinking strategically about access long before she realized he was paying attention to it at all. That afternoon, I walked back to the nurse's station and asked the question again. Not because I had not heard the answer the first time, because sometimes pain becomes more real after repetition. The nurse looked at the screen again and read the name again. Aldrich Carter. Not mine. The answer itself did not surprise me. But hearing it spoken aloud while my daughter lay 30 feet away, attached to machines, settled into my chest differently than I expected. Cold, permanent, heavy in a way grief alone had not yet managed to become. I will tell you what those 10 days were. Not through the emotions I felt, but through what I saw. Day 2. While I was home briefly changing my clothes, Aldrich came to the hospital. A staff member mentioned it to me later. Careful, almost apologetic, the way people deliver information they are not certain you want. He had not asked about Yvette's neurological condition, had not asked whether she had regained consciousness or whether there had been improvement overnight. He asked about paperwork, emergency authorization forms, existing directives, insurance coordination. He stayed less than an hour. Then he left. No one saw him again after that. Day 5, Ruth Ann called me. She lives 3 houses down from Yvette and has known her since the neighborhood association days. She did not want to upset me, she said, but she thought I should know. Music coming from the house most evenings. Different cars in the driveway at night. Too many lights on for a house where the owner was lying unconscious in intensive care. On day 7, she noticed someone carrying boxes from the side entrance toward a vehicle parked near the back alley access road. Not furniture, smaller boxes. The kind people move quickly when they do not want attention. She wrote down the license plate without being asked. That told me everything I needed to know about Ruth Ann. Day 8. I drove past the mansion myself. I did not stop, did not slow down more than traffic required. I looked, cataloged what I could see from the road, and kept moving. There was nothing I could do from the street, but I needed the image in my own head instead of assembled from somebody else's words. I tried reaching Aldrich 4 more times across those 10 days. Different numbers. A borrowed phone once. Nothing. Not a decline, not a voicemail. Just ringing that went nowhere, which is its own kind of answer. On day 6, I contacted Prescott. He spent 30 years in the city clerk's office and understood how paperwork moved through this city. What gets filed quietly, what gets buried in technical language, what appears routine from the outside and is not. I did not ask him for much. Just, look, tell me what's there. He called me back the next evening. What he found was not ownership transfer paperwork like I first feared. It was subtler than that. Aldrich had already initiated legal steps tied to the durable power of attorney Yvette signed after the marriage. Temporary authority requests connected to account management during prolonged medical incapacity. The filing referenced continuation of financial obligations, investment oversight, and operational access if incapacitation extended beyond 30 days. Prescott explained it carefully because he knew enough not to dramatize legal language unnecessarily. None of it automatically transferred ownership. That mattered. But it did create a pathway for broader control over certain active accounts and financial decisions if the incapacity period continued long enough and supporting medical certifications were approved. Her own signature, her own trust, converted into leverage while she lay in intensive care attached to machines. I wrote everything down. Then I read it back to myself once. Then I kept moving. Twice during those 10 days, my phone showed missed calls from a number I did not recognize. No voicemail either time. On day 9, the same number tried again. I still did not answer. I wrote the number down and sat with it for a moment. Not long, just enough to feel the shape of it. Someone calling 3 separate times without leaving a single message is usually one of 2 things: fear or regret. Sometimes both. Prescott called again the following morning after obtaining the full filing details. Account references, temporary authority language, the contingency structure attached to prolonged incapacitation review, and then, almost casually, he mentioned the filing had been submitted through a law office the Carter family used regularly. Asset restructuring. That was how he described their practice area. I wrote those 2 words down. Then I thought about the boxes Ruth Ann saw leaving the property in the dark. 30 days was not simply a medical benchmark anymore. It was becoming a financial timeline. And somewhere inside all of it, people were already moving like they believed Yvette might never fully return to stop them. That night, I sat in my car, in my own driveway, for a long time before I went inside. The envelope was still in the glove compartment where it had always been, tucked beneath the registration papers, exactly where I placed it 4 years earlier. My car has always been the one space in my life that belongs entirely to me. No one else drives it. No one else reaches into it. Whatever I place there stays untouched until I decide otherwise. That was intentional. The same night, I chose not to use what was inside that envelope. I also chose to keep it somewhere private enough that emotion could not tempt me into acting too quickly. I carried it into the house and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. Then I sat across from it for several minutes without opening it, like it was something alive I needed to prepare myself to face again. The contents were not rumors, financial records, partial filings, a settlement agreement protected by a confidentiality clause, development paperwork showing revisions made quietly after the original submission. And underneath those revisions, still faintly visible if you understood legal filings well enough to follow document histories properly, was a name that no longer appeared publicly anywhere connected to the project: Benford Okafor. Benford spent 20 years building a construction company the slow way, through consistency, completed work, and a reputation strong enough that people trusted him before contracts were even signed. The Carter family approached him with a development opportunity large enough to permanently change the scale of his business. He invested capital, equipment, labor, his company's credibility. When the project concluded, the financial structure shifted underneath him, not dramatically, carefully. The kind of restructuring that appears defensible from the outside because every document technically carries signatures somewhere on it. Challenging it would have required years of litigation and money most people no longer possess after being financially drained by the very dispute they are trying to fight. Benford settled. The agreement gave him enough to survive and nowhere near enough to recover. Afterward, his name slowly disappeared from the visible version of the project entirely. I learned about it through a retired paralegal who briefly worked on portions of the original filing years earlier. She recognized the Carter name after Yvette's engagement announcement appeared in the local paper. She called me one Sunday afternoon and asked if I could come by. I still remember her kitchen, quiet, careful, curtains half open against the afternoon sunlight. She spoke slowly, like someone still uncertain whether sharing the information was the right thing to do after all this time. At the end, she told me, "I just thought you deserved to know who your daughter was marrying into." I thanked her. Then I drove home and spent 2 weeks doing absolutely nothing with the information. Because every time I thought about using it, I pictured Yvette's face when she spoke about Aldrich. The hope in it, the trust. My daughter has always loved completely when she chooses to love at all. No halfway version. No cautious version held back for safety. And the truth is, what I had then was not proof of criminality. It was warning, suspicion, a pattern that worried me without fully explaining itself yet. I kept asking myself the same question. What if I was wrong? What if I damaged the beginning of her marriage because I allowed fear to become stronger than certainty? So I chose restraint. I told myself observation was wiser than interference, that if there was truly something dangerous underneath Aldrich Carter, time would expose it eventually without me poisoning my daughter's happiness beforehand. I chose love over instinct. Sitting at my kitchen table 4 years later, I understood my instinct had not been entirely wrong. And for the first time since the accident, regret settled into me heavily enough to feel physical. Not regret for loving my daughter enough to protect her happiness. Regret for underestimating what some people become willing to do once money, access, and control start mattering more to them than human beings. I looked down at the papers spread across my table. Benford's erased name. Yvette, unconscious behind ICU glass. Boxes leaving the mansion in the dark. A 30-day financial threshold already moving quietly toward activation. Then I started making calls. The first one I can tell you about. I called Claudine. Yvette gave me her private number years earlier and said, "For emergencies only." This qualified. Claudine answered on the second ring. I told her everything. Not emotionally. Precisely. She did not interrupt once while I spoke. When I finished, the line stayed silent for several seconds before she finally said, "Give me a few days to think." Then she hung up. The second call I will explain later. The next morning, I stood at my kitchen window drinking coffee gone cold in my hand when I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street. Nothing dramatic about it. No tinted windows. No obvious surveillance. Just unfamiliar. It remained there long enough for me to notice it more than once while moving through the house. By late morning, it was gone. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it belonged to someone visiting nearby. And if I am honest, part of me understood I might already be looking at ordinary things differently because of everything pressing against my mind. Fear does that. Suspicion does that. But after everything I had learned during those previous weeks, I no longer trusted myself to dismiss unusual things automatically either. And somewhere underneath that feeling sat another realization entirely. People only become nervous when they suspect movement around them, which meant, whether they fully understood it yet or not, someone inside that family had started sensing that the silence around them was beginning to change. 6:42. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock the moment the nurse appeared in the doorway and called my name. Not the clock on my phone. The one on the wall. The round institutional kind that hospitals put in every room so time stays visible even when everything else goes uncertain. 6:42 in the morning. I had been in the chair by the window since 4. It was not like the movies. There was no gasp, no sudden clarity, no eyes flying open. It was more like watching someone surface from very deep water, slow and effortful, each stage its own small battle. Her eyelids moved first, then her fingers on the sheet, a slight curl, testing whether they still responded. Then her face, reassembling itself from the inside out, expression returning the way feeling returns to a limb, gradually and in no particular order. The nurses moved with that specific focused energy that means something has changed. I crossed the room and stood at the foot of her bed and waited. Her eyes moved once across the room and stopped, not searching, finding. The way you find something you already know the location of. They found me and they stayed, and I understood in that moment that no matter what had been broken, the part of her that knew her mother was completely intact. I took her hand. Her grip was not strong, but it was deliberate. She closed her fingers around mine with intention, and that intention was everything. Her throat was raw, and her voice came in fragments, so I didn't ask her anything. I talked about small things. The tree outside her window had started turning, I told her. The overnight nurse had introduced me to a television program so ridiculous I had watched 3 episodes without meaning to. It rained Tuesday. She didn't need to respond. She just needed to hear something ordinary while her body remembered how to be in the world. The doctors came mid-morning and gave us the full picture. Incomplete spinal cord injury, which is the better of the 2 possibilities but still means a long road. Rehabilitation would take months, possibly longer. Whether she would regain full mobility, they could not say with certainty. One of them, an older man with a careful way of speaking, said her survival reflected what he called unusual determination. He meant it as a medical observation. I received it as something else entirely. I watched Yvette take in every word, no flinching, no tears. She listened the way she has always listened to hard information, with her whole face still and her mind already moving. The stubbornness that built her career, that carried her through every underpaid year and every room that underestimated her, was right there behind her eyes, untouched by everything that had tried to take it from her. Later, when the room had quieted and the machines had found their rhythm, she looked at me from the pillow and asked the question I had been holding myself ready for. "Where is he?" I held her gaze. I did not look away. I did not answer. The silence did what words would have taken much longer to do. I watched her receive it, fully, without flinching, the same way she had received everything else that morning. She understood. All of it. In the space of a breath. She closed her eyes. I thought she had drifted off. Then her voice came, quiet, rough at the edges, but certain. "Mama, before the accident, I found something." She was asleep before I could ask what. But the way she said it, no surprise in it, no drama, just the particular exhaustion of someone finally setting down something they've been carrying alone for too long, told me she had been living with whatever it was for a while. And that changed everything I thought I understood about the 10 days that came before. The second morning after she woke, I came in to find Yvette already watching the door. Not waiting for a nurse. Waiting for me. I could tell the difference. The particular stillness of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally decided they can no longer carry it alone. She looked toward the window first, just for a moment, organizing herself the way she always has before speaking on something serious, like she needed to line the thoughts up privately before allowing them into the room. Then she looked back at me. "I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone." I sat down beside the bed. Didn't interrupt. Didn't reach for her hand. Just said, "I'm listening." What followed came in pieces over 4 days. Not because she was hiding things, because pain medication, exhaustion, and the sheer effort of recovery made long conversations difficult. Some days, she only managed a few sentences before sleep pulled her back under again. 6 weeks before the accident, she came downstairs late one evening and heard Aldrich and Eula talking in the kitchen. They did not know she was there. She only caught fragments at first. Her name, financial language, irritation underneath the words. Then one phrase clearly enough to remember it later. Before the 30-day window. She stood frozen halfway down the staircase, listening to the sound of her own husband discussing her, in a tone that made her feel suddenly unfamiliar inside her own marriage. Not angry, managed. Like decisions were already being made somewhere she had not been invited. She backed up quietly before they could see her, and sat on the edge of the bed upstairs, trying to convince herself she had misunderstood what she heard. But after that night, she started paying attention differently. 3 weeks before the accident, she noticed a transfer inside one of the investment summaries. Not enormous, not dramatic, small enough that most people would never question it, but unfamiliar. She checked the household records twice and still could not place it, so she wrote it down. Yvette has always trusted documentation more than emotion. She believes feelings can mislead people once fear gets involved. Paper usually doesn't. After that, she started keeping simple notes on her phone. Dates, amounts, conversations she wanted to remember accurately later. Nothing obsessive. Nothing that looked like someone building a case. just small observations she did not want herself explaining away afterward if her instincts turned out to be right. She documented the transfer discrepancy, the phrase she overheard, a conversation where Aldrich gave two different explanations for where he had been one evening that week. Small things separately, larger once they began sitting beside each other. Then she mentioned something else. Years before her marriage, she created a private cloud backup connected to the professional account she used for architectural projects. Automatic syncing, notes, photos, project records, most of it work-related. A habit from years inside firms where losing files could cost people months of effort. Sometimes her personal notes synced there too without her thinking much about it. Aldrich never knew the account existed because it predated him entirely. She mentioned it casually, like it barely mattered. To me, it sounded like the first thing in this entire situation that had developed outside their reach. Then she told me about the phone itself. 2 days after she woke, one of the nurses mentioned in passing that someone had already collected belongings from the towing company connected to the accident. Not through the hospital directly. Through the spouse authorization attached to the emergency paperwork. The nurse only remembered because there had been confusion afterward about which items were supposed to arrive with the remaining property transfer. Most of Yvette's belongings eventually appeared. Her phone never did. Neither of us said much after that. I sat there quietly, turning everything over in my mind. The overheard phrase, the unexplained transfer, the notes, the missing phone, the backup account they did not know existed. None of it proved anything by itself. That mattered. Real life is rarely built from one dramatic revelation. Most of the time, people understand danger gradually, through patterns that only begin making sense after enough pieces gather beside each other. And the shape underneath these pieces was becoming harder to ignore. I did not say out loud what I was beginning to suspect. Not yet. Because once certain thoughts are spoken plainly, they stop being fear and start becoming reality. That evening, I sat beside the hospital window while Yvette slept. Rain pressed softly against the glass. The machines kept their steady rhythm behind me. My phone buzzed against the chair arm. Unknown number. The same number that had called 3 separate times during those 10 silent days without leaving a message. This time, there was a text. One sentence. Stop asking questions. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not proof, not evidence. Could have been anybody trying to frighten me. But it told me something anyway. Somewhere close to all of this, somebody had started realizing the silence around them was no longer holding. We met at a diner on the east side of the city. Corner booth, windows facing the street. Enough noise from dishes and conversations that nobody paid attention to anybody else's table. I arrived first. I always arrive first. The informant came in exactly on time, though they paused just inside the entrance before spotting me. Not hesitation exactly. More like someone standing at the edge of a decision they already knew would change the shape of their life. By the time they reached the booth, their hands were shaking badly enough that they had to hold the coffee cup with both of them. They hadn't slept properly in days. I could see it in the skin beneath their eyes and in the way they kept glancing toward the windows without realizing they were doing it. For the first few minutes, they spoke carefully, like someone testing whether the room itself was safe. Then the truth started coming out in fragments. There had been arguments in the weeks before the accident. Quiet ones at first, then sharper ones. Mostly about money, control. Yvette, questioning transactions Aldrich did not expect her to notice. Eula, involving herself in decisions that should have belonged inside a marriage. The informant had been around enough to feel the atmosphere changing long before the crash happened. People think danger always announces itself loudly. Most of the time, it arrives through tone first. Through the way conversations stop when someone enters a room, through explanations that become too polished, through tension living underneath ordinary things. A week before the accident, the informant overheard part of a conversation in the kitchen late at night. Not the whole thing. Just pieces that stayed with them afterward because of how strange the tone felt. Eula was angry. Not emotional angry. Controlled angry. The kind that comes from someone used to getting their way. At one point, she said, "She's starting to question everything now." Aldrich answered something too low to hear clearly, then louder. "She's making this harder than it needs to be." The informant told me they remembered that sentence because it didn't sound like a husband talking about a disagreement anymore. It sounded like somebody talking about a problem. After that, smaller things started bothering them. A man they had never seen before showing up twice at the house during the same week. A dark SUV parked down the block one evening longer than seemed normal. Aldrich leaving the house late one night and coming back almost 2 hours later, visibly agitated. Nothing criminal by itself, nothing you could hand police and expect action from. Just pieces that began feeling different after the accident happened. Then came the name, Levon. The informant heard it once during a tense phone conversation between Aldrich and someone else 2 days before the crash. No context, just the name. And Aldrich saying, "I already told him not to make this messy." That line stayed with the informant afterward because of how quickly Aldrich noticed someone nearby and ended the call. The informant looked down at the table while telling me all this, like they were still trying to decide whether their own memory could be trusted fully. That mattered to me. People inventing stories usually rush towards certainty. People telling the truth tend to pause where their knowledge ends. The informant never claimed to know exactly what Levon was supposed to do. They never claimed they heard anyone order harm. What they said was simpler and somehow more disturbing. They believed something was already moving underneath that household before the accident happened. Pressure, financial panic, fear of losing control. The kind of environment where reckless people begin making reckless decisions and convincing themselves they can still manage the consequences afterward. Then they said something else, quietly. 3 nights before the accident, they saw Aldrich meeting someone outside a strip mall on the north side. They only noticed because the meeting happened late enough to feel unusual. The informant reached into their pocket and slid their phone across the table. There was a photograph on the screen. Grainy, distant, taken through a windshield. Aldrich standing beside a dark SUV near the edge of the parking lot. Eula several feet away near the passenger side. And a third man partially turned from the camera. No dramatic handoff. No visible crime. Just people standing together where none of them later claimed to have been. I studied the image quietly before sliding the phone back. Not courtroom proof, but real. Real enough to establish contact. Real enough to establish timing. Real enough to make investigators ask harder questions later if other evidence began pointing in the same direction. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Are you willing to tell this to the right people, formally?" The informant looked back down at their hands. The shaking still had not stopped. "I don't know yet," they admitted. And again, the honesty mattered more to me than confidence would have. I paid for the coffee before either of us finished drinking it. I told them I was not asking for heroics. Just truth when the time came. Outside, the afternoon air felt colder than it had when I arrived. I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine. Levon, a first name, a blurry photograph, fragments of overheard conversations, a household already cracking underneath financial pressure long before the crash ever happened. Still not enough to prove what truly happened that morning on Route 9, but enough to make one thing impossible to ignore anymore. The accident no longer felt isolated, and by then, I already knew exactly whose hand could help me push the next door open. She opened the door before I knocked. She had been watching for my car. She stepped back and said, "Come in," the way people say it when they have been waiting with intention. Not hospitality, readiness. There was already a folder on the dining table. She had been working before I arrived. Claudine is 73 years old. She spent 35 years as a real estate attorney before retiring, and during those decades, she built the kind of network that rarely appears publicly, but quietly shapes outcomes underneath the surface of a city. She does not attend charity events to be seen. She attends them to understand who is aligned with whom, which projects are stable, which people are over-leveraged, and where pressure already exists before anyone admits it openly. She is one of the most formidable women I have ever sat across from. And I have never told her that because I suspect she already knows. She had been thinking since my call 3 days earlier. She told me she needed to confirm something before we met. And unlike most people, when Claudine says she is confirming something, she means actual work is already happening behind the sentence. She had not been idle. 2 years into Yvette's marriage, the Carter family approached Claudine directly. They wanted help structuring a development opportunity that relied heavily on Yvette's professional reputation, her name, her portfolio, her industry standing. To strengthen access to financing and approvals they were struggling to secure independently. Claudine declined immediately, not dramatically, just firmly enough that no second conversation followed. But afterward, she documented the interaction anyway. The original email from Aldrich's brother, notes from a follow-up call involving Eula, the proposed structure itself, nothing illegal on its face. That mattered. But the request revealed something Claudine did not like: the degree to which the family viewed Yvette primarily as access rather than as a person. So she filed the material away under the Carter name and kept it. Not because she anticipated criminal behavior someday, because experienced attorneys learn to preserve patterns even when patterns are not yet actionable. Claudine stopped speaking for a moment after telling me this. She looked down at the folder on the table. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, "I should have told her." It was the only moment during that entire meeting where she looked like something other than a woman completely in control. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then she picked up her phone. The first call did not solve anything immediately. That part matters. The financial forensic specialist she trusted was already involved in another matter out of state and initially told her he could not begin a full review for nearly a week. Claudine persuaded him to at least look at the preliminary documents first. That was the actual beginning, not dramatic intervention. Priority review. He agreed to examine whatever Prescott had uncovered and determine whether the activity justified urgent escalation. Over the next 2 days, other pieces came together gradually through Claudine's network. Not instantly. One investigator she trusted declined involvement entirely because of an active conflict with another client connected loosely to the Carter business structure. A second recommendation finally worked. A private investigator with prior federal contract experience who specialized in financial tracing and document coordination. The legal team took longer. One attorney reviewed the situation and advised caution before agreeing to participate. Another wanted additional documentation before attaching the firm's name to anything involving emergency incapacity proceedings. People protecting their professional reputations move carefully. That realism actually reassured me, because reckless professionals are usually dangerous professionals. Eventually, Claudine assembled the right group: a forensic financial specialist, a private investigator, and attorneys experienced specifically in asset disputes involving incapacitation and marital financial authority. None of it happened through one miraculous phone call. It happened through relationships built carefully over decades by a woman whose judgment people trusted because she almost never used that trust lightly. That is what real access looks like: slow, specific, credibility-based. I returned to the hospital during those days and sat beside Yvette without telling her how much movement had already started forming around her quietly. I watched her sleep. I kept my phone close. On Wednesday, the preliminary financial review officially began. By Friday afternoon, the forensic specialist called back with something that shifted the urgency immediately. Aldrich had already initiated movement inside one of the investment structures connected to the temporary authority filing. Not direct theft, not dramatic withdrawal, structured movement. The kind designed to resemble ordinary portfolio management activity, unless someone examined the timing closely beside the incapacitation paperwork. The specialist explained that one completed movement by itself would likely not trigger alarms internally. But the pattern concerned him, especially because additional reallocation instructions appeared queued pending continuation of the incapacitation certification timeline. The 30-day threshold now had 17 days remaining. We had to move before broader authority activated fully. And for the first time since the accident happened, I realized this situation was no longer only about fear. It was about timing. I am not a lawyer. I want to say that plainly before I explain what happened next, because what happened next involved emergency filings, court procedures, and legal timing precise enough that I could never have managed it alone. What I contributed was documentation, preparation, relationships, weeks of careful observation. What Claudine's legal team contributed was understanding exactly how and where pressure needed to be applied before more damage could be done. The process did not move as cleanly as people imagine when they hear these stories afterward. There were delays immediately. One of the financial records Prescott uncovered had been submitted without a complete certification page attached. The forensics specialist needed additional verification on the pending transfer activity before the court would even consider emergency intervention. Half a day disappeared, waiting on supporting documentation from the bank. Half a day matters when someone believes they still control the clock. By Wednesday evening, the legal team still wasn't certain the judge would grant immediate relief without requiring a longer hearing process. The evidence was strong, but emergency orders are serious instruments. Courts do not issue them simply because people are frightened. The investigator worked through most of that night assembling supporting affidavits and supplemental documentation, tying the account activity to Yvette's incapacitated condition. Thursday morning, the motion was finally filed. The request was specific and narrow: temporary suspension of Aldrich's medical and financial authority, pending formal review due to credible evidence of attempted financial exploitation during incapacity. Not accusations, not conclusions. Risk. That distinction mattered legally. The judge reviewed the filing that afternoon. Then everyone waited. I sat in the hospital cafeteria with untouched coffee in front of me while Claudine's legal associate checked her phone every few minutes without speaking. Across the room, two nurses were laughing quietly over something unrelated to our lives entirely. And I remember thinking how strange it is that ordinary life continues moving while your own feels suspended between outcomes. At 4:16, the call finally came. The temporary protective order had been granted pending formal hearing review. Limited, emergency, immediate. Aldrich's medical decision-making authority was suspended temporarily. The flagged accounts connected to the pending transfers were frozen before additional movement could clear. Not permanently, but long enough. Long enough changes everything, sometimes. He did not know any of this yet. The same afternoon, the investigator formally submitted supporting materials to law enforcement through proper channels. The photograph connected to Levon, the financial forensics summary, the account activity timeline, and the preliminary witness information suggesting intentional interference surrounding the accident. It did not produce arrests. It did not produce dramatic confrontations. It produced what real cases usually produce first: an inquiry, quiet, procedural, slow-moving at the beginning. But once certain doors open officially, they become difficult to close quietly afterward. At that point, Aldrich still believed he was operating inside a protected window. He believed Yvette remained vulnerable, her mother remained emotional instead of strategic, and the 30-day threshold was still moving uninterrupted toward him. Every decision he had made since the accident depended on those assumptions remaining true. He just didn't yet understand that the ground underneath those assumptions had already started shifting. That gap between what he believed was happening and what had actually begun moving around him became the most important space in the entire case. I went to the hospital afterward carrying 2 documents inside a folder. One established legal representation for Yvette moving forward. The second clarified her intent regarding the accounts and property connected to the emergency filing. Her hand trembled badly while signing. The medication still affected her coordination, and the injury exhausted her quickly. It took time, but the signatures were unmistakably hers. Clear, deliberate, competent. That mattered more than anything else in the room. When she finished, she leaned back carefully against the pillows and looked at me for a long moment. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked quietly. "Since the night they told me who had authority over you." She closed her eyes after that. Not from sadness, from relief. The kind that only comes when someone realizes they were not left alone nearly as long as they feared they had been. We sat together quietly for a while after that. No strategy discussions, no legal language, just silence shared between 2 women who had spent their entire lives surviving difficult things differently, but stubbornly. Before leaving the hospital, I checked in with the informant again. They still had not agreed to make a formal statement. And, honestly, I understood why. Formal cooperation sounds noble when people discuss it afterward. In reality, it means fear, exposure, the possibility of your own life changing permanently because you finally told the truth out loud. I told them the investigation had already started moving regardless, but that their voice would matter eventually if they decided to use it. Then I let them go. Saturday morning, I was sitting in the hospital parking lot reviewing paperwork when my phone rang. A nurse, calling from her personal phone instead of the hospital line. Her voice was careful in the way people's voices become when they already understand something bad has entered the building. "There are 3 people coming upstairs right now," she said quietly. "One of them is the husband." 17 days. That was how long it had taken him to come see his wife, and he had not come alone. The nurse's call gave me 4 minutes. I walked to Yvette's room, closed the door behind me, and told her who was coming. She didn't ask how many. She didn't ask what they wanted. She looked at me with the particular steadiness of someone who has already processed a thing and is simply waiting for it to arrive. I asked her one question. "Are you ready?" She adjusted herself slightly against the pillow. A small, deliberate movement. The kind that takes effort when your body is still negotiating with itself. Then she said, "I've been ready." I positioned myself by the window. The legal representative took the chair beside the bed. We didn't speak. We waited. Aldrich came in first. His chin was at a particular angle, not quite arrogance, something more calculated than that. An expression arranged to occupy the space between concern and authority. He was wearing a coat I recognized. Yvette had bought it for his birthday 2 years ago. He didn't look at me when he entered. He looked at Yvette, briefly, a glance that didn't land anywhere. And then his eyes moved to the legal representative. "Who are you?" She introduced herself by name and firm. Then she explained, in the measured tone of someone delivering information rather than making an argument, that effective as of Thursday, his authority to make medical decisions on behalf of his wife had been suspended by emergency temporary protective order pending a full hearing, and that his access to the flagged accounts had been frozen pending the court's review. She placed the documentation on the tray table and invited him to review it with his counsel. Eula started before the papers were fully on the table. Her voice went high and sharp, the register of a woman who has used volume as authority her entire life and has never had reason to doubt its effectiveness. Their attorney put a hand out, a quiet gesture that meant stop, and picked up the documents. He went silent. The specific silence of someone reading something that requires thought before any response is possible. He read the first page, then the second. He didn't look up. Aldrich said nothing. He looked at the papers. He looked at the legal representative. Then, for the first time since he walked through that door, he looked fully at his wife. Yvette looked back at him. No words, no tears, no rage. Just the steadiness of a woman who had spent 17 days understanding exactly who she had married and had arrived at the end of what that understanding required of her. It was not anger in her eyes. It was the particular quiet of someone who has already moved forward and is watching the past try to catch up. He received that look, and something in him, something that had been arranged with considerable effort, went very still. They left 12 minutes after they arrived. The attorney was already speaking quietly to Aldrich before they reached the door. I followed at a distance. In the hallway, Eula turned and found me. She stepped close. She said something low, a warning dressed in the language of a woman who has never once been held accountable for what comes out of her mouth and has no reason yet to believe that is about to change. I looked at her for a moment. Then I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled in 17 days. She didn't understand it. She held my gaze for one more second, then turned and walked away. She didn't know yet that the inquiry filed Thursday had named her specifically, not Aldrich, her by name, as the directing party. The investigator called on a Tuesday morning, nearly 3 months after the emergency protective order was granted. By then, the case no longer moved with the speed of crisis. It moved with the slower, heavier rhythm of institutions building something carefully enough that it would survive examination later. Subpoenas, document requests, financial tracing, jurisdiction questions, waiting, a great deal of waiting. When he spoke that morning, he used a phrase I had not heard before. Federal scope. He said it calmly, professionally, the way experienced people say things they understand the weight of without needing to dramatize them. The inquiry had expanded beyond the accident itself and beyond the immediate financial activity surrounding Yvette's accounts. During the forensic review, investigators identified transfers tied to multiple business entities operating across state lines, layered LLC structures, interstate wire activity, and account movements inconsistent with the explanations already provided by the Carter family's attorneys. That triggered additional review automatically through financial compliance channels. More agencies became involved quietly after that. Not conclusions, not charges, review. That distinction mattered. The investigator was careful to say the federal interest did not mean anyone had already decided a crime occurred. It meant the financial structure underneath the situation had become complicated enough that certain records now fell under broader jurisdictional attention. Paper attracts attention eventually, when enough of it stops aligning cleanly. I thanked him and ended the call and sat at my kitchen table for a long moment afterward, letting those 2 words settle properly inside me. Federal scope. I thought about the Carter family at charity events over the years, church anniversary programs with their names printed in gold lettering near the donor section. Community newsletters carrying the same polished photograph every holiday season. The kind of family people assume must be trustworthy because they have spent years being seen publicly doing respectable things. I wondered if any of them had ever considered how fragile a surface becomes once enough people begin looking underneath it at the same time. Then I stood up, rinsed my coffee cup, and kept moving. The material I had provided months earlier, Benford's records, the settlement agreement, the original development filings with his removed name still visible underneath later revisions, entered the broader review quietly, not as a headline. Pattern material. That was the phrase Claudine's legal team actually used after correcting me once when I called it evidence. Pattern material does not prove a current crime by itself. What it does is establish familiarity, similar financial behavior appearing across different years, different projects, different people. It changes how investigators interpret newer activity sitting beside it. The Financial Forensic Review uncovered inconsistencies tied to older Carter business structures, while tracing recent transfers connected to Yvette's accounts. From there came requests for archived records, attorney resistance, motions to limit disclosure, delays. Nothing happened quickly. The request to partially unseal portions of Benford's settlement file took weeks moving through attorneys and court review before limited access was granted under investigative relevance. Benford's attorney contacted investigators shortly afterward, not because he suddenly trusted the system, because the system had finally begun asking questions specific enough to matter. Benford had kept his own records all these years. Copies, transaction summaries, personal notes written during meetings he no longer fully trusted even while attending them. Not because he expected justice someday, because some losses leave people unable to completely throw the evidence away. Discarding it feels too much like agreeing that what happened to you did not matter. I thought again about the retired paralegal who first warned me, her quiet kitchen, her careful voice, and somewhere else in the city, Benford storing those records for years while the Carter family continued appearing publicly, as though nothing underneath them had ever shifted. Two people carrying the same truth from opposite ends of it without knowing the other existed. There was something deeply sad about that, and something deeply satisfying about the fact that he was finally being heard. About 2 weeks after Benford's materials formally entered review, Aldrich's attorney contacted Claudine's legal team with a settlement proposal. I was told the amount. I will not repeat it because the figure itself was not what mattered. What mattered was the thinking behind it. Even after months of subpoenas, account freezes, document reviews, and mounting forensic scrutiny, they still believed this was fundamentally a negotiation. Still believed money could reduce consequence into something manageable. Claudine declined the proposal without countering. No discussion, no strategy meeting, no back and forth, just no. When I heard that, something moved through me that almost resembled laughter. Not amusement, recognition. They still did not understand the room they were standing in, and that misunderstanding was becoming more expensive by the week. 3 days later, my phone rang. Not a lawyer's office, not a blocked number. Aldrich himself. The same number I had called 17 times across 10 days of silence while my daughter lay in intensive care. His voice sounded different now. Not polished, not controlled, tired in a way that reaches underneath the words themselves. He said he needed to speak with me privately. No attorneys, no family, no interruptions. Something he could only explain face to face. I did not answer immediately. I let the silence sit between us long enough for him to feel it. Then I told him I would think about it. The next morning, I called him back. One meeting. Nothing more. I told him, you choose the place. Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after she opened her eyes. The rehabilitation gym smelled of rubber flooring and effort. Yvette stood at the entrance of the parallel bars with her physical therapist on one side, and a second one positioned behind her. Her arms were already shaking before she took the first step. I was across the room, far enough that she wouldn't feel watched, close enough that she could find my face if she needed it. She took 2.5 steps. Then she stopped. Her arms were trembling against the bars, and her jaw was set in the way it gets when she is deciding something internal that no one else is invited into. The therapist said, "We can stop here. That's excellent progress for today." Yvette said, "I'm not stopping here." She finished the third step. Then she stood still, hands on the bars, chest rising and falling, everything it had cost her written plainly in her body. She looked up and found me across the room. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. Some things don't require words when the people involved have already been through everything that words are insufficient for. 2 days later, she gave her formal statement to the investigators. Her attorney was present throughout. It ran 2.5 hours. She described the staircase, the overheard phrase, the account discrepancy, the notes she had kept on her phone, the cloud backup account that predated the marriage and that Aldrich had never known existed. She gave them the credentials to access it herself directly in that room. The sink had run the morning of the accident. Everything was there, intact, time-stamped, in her own handwriting and her own voice. The account discrepancy with its exact figure, the overheard conversation transcribed as precisely as memory allowed, and a photograph she had taken from an upstairs window, an unfamiliar vehicle parked outside the mansion on 3 consecutive evenings, the week before the crash. The license plate was visible in all 3 images. The investigators ran the plate that afternoon. I was not told immediately what they found. I didn't need to be. The fact that the call came within hours told me enough. What Yvette's documentation gave the case was not simply new information. Much of what she described the investigation already had from other sources. What it gave them was her voice, her clarity, her own account of what had been done to her recorded before it was done to her. There is no legal substitute for a living witness who documented her own suspicion in real time and survived to deliver it. That is not evidence that can be argued around. That is a door that closes permanently. The motion to restore her as sole authority over all documents, accounts, and property was granted within the week. Every restructured document, every account accessed under the power of attorney. The mansion, all it returned to her name, fully and without condition. That evening, I came to her rehabilitation room and found her sitting up straighter than she had the week before. Small things mark recovery when you know what to look for. She looked at me for a moment and then asked, "Did they know you were coming for them?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "No," I said. "Not until it was too late to do anything about it." She was quiet. Then, "What about her?" We both knew who she meant. I looked at my daughter, this woman who had walked 3 steps this morning on legs that weren't sure of her, and I said, "That part isn't finished yet." Ruth Ann called on a Wednesday morning, her voice carrying that careful quality it gets when she has something to deliver and isn't certain how it will land. She said the Carter family's annual foundation spotlight, the one that ran in the neighborhood newsletter every October without fail, the one that featured their photograph and a summary of their charitable contributions, had not appeared. She had checked their social media page as well. Nothing posted in 3 weeks, no announcements, no photographs, just silence where there had always been a carefully maintained presence. "I just thought you'd want to know," she said. I thanked her. I stood at my kitchen window after the call and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. It had begun. The charity board on which Eula had served for 11 years sent her a letter asking her to step back from active participation pending resolution of a personal legal matter. It was not a public statement. No press release. No announcement to the membership. Just a letter delivered to her home. But letters travel through assistants, through board members who mention things to spouses, through the particular social infrastructure of people who have spent years building reputations in the same rooms. Within days, the right people knew. Aldrich's professional association removed his listing from their member directory. No explanation posted alongside the absence. No statement issued. Just a name that had been there and then wasn't, which, in professional circles, communicates everything a formal statement would and more, because it leaves no room for a crafted response. The church did not feature the Carter family in its upcoming community bulletin. They had appeared in that bulletin every quarter for 6 years. Photographs, updates, a mention of their latest contribution. This quarter, there was nothing. When a member of the congregation asked the pastor directly, he said only that the family had requested privacy during a difficult period. That explanation satisfied no one and was not meant to. I want to be honest about what I felt watching all of this happen. It was not satisfaction, not the clean, simple kind that people imagine when they picture justice arriving. It was something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a tension that has been held in the body for a very long time, beginning, slowly, to release. A breath that had been suspended for months, finally moving again. I allowed myself that feeling for exactly the time it took to walk from my kitchen window to my front door. Then I put it away. There was still work left to finish. The informant had given their formal statement in the 4 weeks between the emergency protective order and this point. Protected, their identity shielded from public disclosure. On record, sworn, attached to the case file, carrying the weight of testimony. They had found their courage in their own time and on their own terms. I did not take credit for that. It belonged entirely to them. Aldrich's attorney had by this point advised him that full cooperation with the federal investigation was his most viable remaining option. Full cooperation meant providing complete testimony about the planning and execution of the staged accident. It meant naming the person who had directed it. The family that had operated as a unified front for decades was now being asked to choose between its members. It was consuming itself quietly from the inside out. My phone rang Thursday evening. I looked at the screen. Aldrich's personal cell, not his attorney's office, not a blocked number. Him. He said he needed to talk, not through lawyers, just the two of us, somewhere neutral, something he could only say in person. I let it ring 3 full times. Then I answered. I said, "I'll meet you. Once, you choose the place." He chose a hotel restaurant on the north side of the city. Heavy curtains, low lighting, booths spaced far enough apart that conversations stayed private without looking secretive. The kind of place people choose when they want witnesses nearby, but not close enough to hear anything useful. I understood the choice immediately. Aldrich wanted public safety without public exposure. That told me more about his state of mind than anything he could have said out loud. I arrived first. 10 minutes later, he walked in alone. No EULA, no attorney, no performance of confidence. He had lost weight in the uneven way that comes from prolonged stress rather than discipline. His suit hung slightly wrong across the shoulders. There were deep shadows beneath his eyes that expensive grooming could not fully hide anymore. More than once during the first few minutes, he looked instinctively toward the restaurant entrance, like a man who had spent too many weeks expecting bad news to walk through doors. He sat down slowly across from me and stared at his hands before speaking. For almost 30 seconds, he said nothing at all. Then he started trying to explain. Not confess. Explain. There is a difference. He said the situation had spiraled further than he expected. That financial pressure inside the family had become worse over time. That arguments between Yvette and Eula kept escalating. That people started making reckless decisions trying to regain control of problems growing faster than they could contain them. Every sentence pushed responsibility slightly outward. Not enough to sound innocent, just enough to avoid standing completely alone inside what happened. I listened quietly. I did not interrupt him, did not rescue him from silence, did not soften any pause he created himself. Eventually, the explanations weakened under their own weight. What came after them sounded closer to remorse, though not the clean kind people feel when conscience finally overtakes self-preservation. This sounded more like exhaustion, a man running out of energy to maintain the structure he had been hiding inside. He acknowledged that Levon entered the situation through someone loosely connected to his brother. He admitted there had been conversations inside the family about Yvette becoming suspicious regarding finances. He admitted he ignored warning signs much longer than he should have. But even then, he stayed careful. Careful with verbs. Careful with certainty. Careful with direct ownership. That mattered to me. People often imagine guilt arrives dramatically. Most of the time, it arrives partially. Incomplete, still trying to protect itself while collapsing. I let him speak until there was nothing left holding him upright except exhaustion. Then I spoke. Not emotionally, not angrily, just plainly. I told him the cloud backup existed and that investigators already had access to Yvette's notes, timestamps, photographs, and account records from before the accident. I told him the vehicle connected to Levon had already drawn investigative attention through traffic review and corroborating witness timelines. I told him the informant had formally cooperated weeks earlier. That part visibly landed. Not dramatically, but deeply. His eyes closed for one brief second when I said it, and I understood immediately that he had spent weeks convincing himself the informant would stay silent. I continued. I told him Benford's records had entered the broader financial review process, that forensic accountants were now examining older Carter business activity alongside the more recent account transfers connected to Yvette's incapacitation period. That subpoenas had expanded, that his attorneys already understood the situation was moving beyond a simple civil dispute. Then I told him something else. His legal team had already discussed cooperation pathways with investigators. Not immunity, not escape. Just the possibility of limiting how much worse things could still become, depending on the level of cooperation provided moving forward. If he waited too long, the evidence would eventually begin organizing itself without him. And evidence is usually less forgiving than people are. He sat very still after that. The restaurant noise continued around us. Silverware, low conversations, glasses touching tables softly. But our booth felt strangely separate from all of it. For the first time since I met him years earlier, Aldrich looked exactly like what he was. Not polished, not charming, not strategic, just tired. Tired in the way people become when every structure holding their life together has started collapsing at once. Finally, he asked, "Does Yvette know I'm here?" I answered honestly, "No. This conversation is between you and the consequences of your choices." He looked down at the folder resting beside his hand. Not official agreements, not signed statements. Just information his attorneys had prepared outlining possible next steps, if he decided to cooperate formally later. For a long time, he did not move. Then slowly, like someone realizing there were no remaining exits left to calculate toward, he opened the folder and began reading. I left him there with it. In the parking lot, I called Yvette. I did not give details. She did not ask for them. I only said, "It's moving now. What happens next belongs to you." She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she asked softly, "What about her?" We both knew who she meant. I looked out across the parking lot at the rain beginning to fall against the pavement and said, "That part already started." She just doesn't know it yet. Tuesday morning. Yvette's rehabilitation room. She was working through hand exercises when I arrived. Slow, controlled movements against a resistance band looped between her fingers. Recovery had taught her patience the hard way. Every small motion now carried intention inside it. I sat beside her quietly and placed my phone on the armrest. 7 minutes later, it buzzed. A message from the legal team. The warrant was executed this morning. I read it once, then again. Yvette looked over immediately. She has always read my face the way some people read familiar handwriting. Quickly, completely, without effort. She lowered the resistance band slightly. Her? I nodded once. Outside the rehabilitation window, the morning sky sat low and gray over the city, undecided between rain and sunlight. We stayed quiet together for a long moment while somewhere else across town, Eula Carter was finally standing inside consequences that no amount of reputation management could smooth over anymore. After a minute, Yvette lifted the resistance band again and resumed the exercise. That, more than anything else, told me she was finally healing. Not because she no longer cared, because her life was no longer orbiting around them. The details reached me gradually throughout the day through calls from attorneys and investigators. Federal agents and financial investigators had arrived at Eula's residence shortly after 7:30 that morning, with search warrants tied to the expanded financial and obstruction inquiry already moving through review. Professional, controlled, no dramatic spectacle. But neighborhoods notice things, especially neighborhoods built on routine. People noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked too long. They noticed investigators entering the home carrying document cases. They noticed attorneys arriving quickly afterward. They noticed Eula leaving several hours later, looking nothing like the woman who used to glide through charity events, controlling every room she entered. And once one person noticed, the information moved the way information always moves through connected communities. Quietly first, then everywhere at once. By lunchtime, Ruth Ann had already called me, not with gossip, with disbelief. The woman who spent years building herself into a local symbol of refinement and authority now existed inside whispered conversations instead of polished photographs. And there was no public statement strong enough to hold back what had already begun unraveling. The broader case itself continued moving slowly, carefully, exactly the way serious cases do. Grand jury review, financial tracing, negotiations between attorneys, expanding subpoenas, additional witness cooperation. Nothing instant, nothing theatrical. The allegations investigators were building around Eula centered on financial conspiracy, fraudulent coordination surrounding incapacitation proceedings, obstruction concerns connected to evidence handling, and broader financial irregularities developed through months of forensic review and cooperating testimony. Not television justice, paperwork, records, witnesses, patterns. The kind of evidence that builds quietly until eventually enough of it stands together that the structure holding someone's life upright simply stops surviving contact with reality. Several weeks after the warrant execution, formal charges followed. By then, the damage had already spread far beyond the courtroom itself. Aldrich's eventual cooperation agreement reduced portions of his criminal exposure, though the civil consequences moved separately and heavily on their own timeline. The forensic accounting eventually completed its review of every flagged transaction tied to the emergency authority filings after the accident. Every account movement, every restructuring request, every attempted transfer. Documented. The mansion remained legally Yvette's. The temporary financial permissions and emergency authorizations connected to Aldrich were formally revoked and unwound through the court process. The frozen assets were restored fully under her control. Benford eventually received a settlement tied to the reopened financial review surrounding the earlier development project. It was not enough. Nothing fully returns years taken from somebody's life. But his name was restored permanently to the original records that once tried to erase him from the story entirely. And sometimes restoration matters almost as much as compensation. Levon's eventual testimony closed one of the final investigative gaps. Not a mastermind conspiracy. Not a movie plot. Just reckless people making increasingly dangerous decisions while trying to maintain control over money, image, and fear. Investigators ultimately established unlawful interference connected to the vehicle. The financial pressure campaign surrounding Yvette's incapacitation was documented. The account manipulation attempts were documented. And piece by piece, the version of reality the Carter family depended on began collapsing underneath the weight of records they could no longer explain away. The church stopped featuring them in community programs. The board quietly requested resignations. Professional directories changed. Invitations disappeared. No speeches, no dramatic public shaming, no press conference declaring moral victory. Just absence replacing presence, which is usually how real social collapse happens. 8 months after the accident, Yvette walked back into her home under her own power. Slowly. Deliberately. Her gait still carried traces of what happened to her, and maybe always would. But she moved with the kind of steadiness that belongs to people who survived something that tried very hard to permanently reduce them. Her physical therapist told her the week before that her recovery had exceeded nearly every early projection. Yvette answered simply, "I had something to come back for." I stood beside her in the entrance hall, looking at the house the same way I had the first time she invited me there years earlier. Not seeing wealth, seeing cost, the years, the discipline, the sacrifice, the mornings she kept going when easier paths existed. I thought about a hospital parking lot, a sealed envelope in my glove compartment, a voice on the phone telling me we were low-level, unwanted, unworthy. Then I looked at my daughter standing inside everything she had fought her way back toward. And quietly, almost to myself, I said, "Low level, look at us now."